Today, we're going to tell a story, but it's not a simple one. It's a story so immense it spans tens of thousands of years and an entire continent. It's the story of the first peoples of the Americas. Now, when we hear the term Native American, many of us have a single, monolithic image in our minds, an image crafted by old movies and incomplete history books. But that reality was a breathtaking tapestry of hundreds of distinct nations, thousands of languages, and a vibrant spectrum of cultures. This is not just a story of tragedy, though there is much of that. It is a story of resilience, innovation, and a connection to this land that is almost impossible to comprehend. This is the story of a world that existed for millennia before its great violent interruption. Our story begins at the end of the last ice age. For thousands of years, people lived and thrived in the Americas, a hemisphere teeming with life. By the time the first European ships appeared on the horizon, this land was home to an estimated 60 to 100 million people. From the Arctic to the tip of South America, these weren't just scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers. They were complex societies that shaped the world around them. In the arid Southwest, the ancestral Puebloan peoples built staggering multi-story cities of stone and mud, like the cliff palaces of Mesa Verde. They were master astronomers and agriculturalists, coaxing corn, beans, and squash from the dry earth. Further east, along the Mississippi River, another civilization arose. We call them the Mississippians. They were city builders. Their capital, Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, was a sprawling metropolis with a population larger than London's at the time. Great earthen pyramids stood at its center, a testament to a sophisticated social and religious structure. In the dense eastern woodlands, nations like the Iroquois and the Algonquian formed powerful confederations. They lived in longhouses, cultivated the land, and maintained vast trade networks that crisscrossed the continent. The Pacific Northwest was home to peoples like the Chinook, who lived in permanent villages and developed rich artistic traditions, their wealth displayed in lavish feasts called potlatches. These cultures were as different from each other as a Roman was from a Viking. They had their own governments, their own religions, their own sciences, and their own histories passed down through generations. They understood this land, its plants, its animals, its seasons, with a depth born from thousands of years of observation and respect. It was a world in balance. But then, in 1492, that world broke. It wasn't a discovery, it was a collision. When Christopher Columbus and his crew made landfall, they did not arrive in an empty wilderness. They stumbled into a world that was ancient, complex, and utterly unprepared for what was coming. The most devastating conquerors were invisible. They were microbes. European settlers brought with them diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, having been isolated for millennia, had no natural immunity. The result was a biological catastrophe, a great dying that swept across the continent with terrifying speed. In many places, up to 90% of the population was wiped out within a single century. Entire villages vanished. The loss of elders, leaders, and knowledge keepers shattered societies before a single battle was fought. This devastation was followed by a clash of worldviews. Europeans brought with them the concept of private property, of fences and deeds. For native people, land was not something to be owned. It was a resource to be shared by the community, a sacred entity. This fundamental misunderstanding would fuel centuries of conflict. Colonists saw the New World as a place of endless resources to be exploited. They cleared forests, overhunted animals like the beaver, and introduced new livestock that destroyed native ecosystems. They also brought a new religion, and with it a conviction that native spiritual traditions were savage and needed to be replaced, often by force. And then there was the labor. Colonizers forced indigenous peoples into slavery to work on plantations and in mines. When disease and brutal conditions decimated the native workforce, Europeans turned to another continent, Africa, beginning the horrific transatlantic slave trade. The story of America became a complex and tragic interaction of three worlds. With the birth of the United States, the pressure on native lands became a national policy. Leaders who had spoken of liberty and justice for all did not extend those ideals to the original inhabitants of the land. This brings us to one of the shameful chapters in American history, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Signed into law by President Andrew Jackson, the act gave the federal government the power to forcibly relocate native nations from their ancestral homelands in the Southeast to a designated Indian territory west of the Mississippi River, what is now Oklahoma. Tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, known as the Five Civilized Tribes because they had adopted many American customs, including writing systems and constitutional governments, were targeted. They had treaties, they had farms, they had schools, but they also had land that white settlers coveted. What followed was a journey of horror known as the Trail of Tears. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children were rounded up by the U.S. military and forced to march over 1,000 miles. They suffered from disease, starvation, and exposure. Thousands died before they ever reached their destination. It was an act of ethnic cleansing, a scar on the soul of a nation. And it didn't end there. As the United States pushed its borders ever westward, the same pattern of broken treaties, violent conflict, and forced displacement was repeated time and again against the tribes of the Great Plains, the Southwest, and the Pacific Coast. By the end of the 19th century, the wars were mostly over. The surviving native peoples were confined to reservations, often on parcels of land that were a fraction of their original territories and unsuitable for farming. The U.S. government then began a new kind of war, a war on culture. The goal was total assimilation. Native languages and religious practices were outlawed. A generation of children was forcibly taken from their families and sent to residential boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their own language and taught that their culture was inferior. The motto of these schools was "Kill the Indian, save the man." But the story of the native peoples is not just one of tragedy. It is also one of immense resilience and an unbreakable spirit. In the mid-20th century, a new fire was lit. It was called the Red Power movement. A new generation of native activists, inspired by the civil rights movement, began to demand that the United States honor its treaties and recognize tribal sovereignty. In 1969, a group of activists occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, not as prisoners, but as owners, reclaiming the land under an old Sioux treaty. The occupation lasted 19 months and brought the plight of Native Americans to the world's attention. This was followed by other powerful protests, the Trail of Broken Treaties, a march on Washington, D.C. in 1972, and the armed standoff at Wounded Knee in 1973, which powerfully evoked the memory of the 1890 massacre. These activists fought back not just with protests, but in the courts. They fought for the right to self-determination, for the protection of their lands and water, for the freedom to educate their children in their own languages and traditions. So the whole story of Native Americans, it can't be told in 15 minutes or even 15 hours because it's not over. Today, there are over 570 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States, each with its own government, culture, and history. The challenges are still immense. Native communities continue to fight for their treaty rights, to protect their sacred lands from exploitation, and to heal from generations of trauma. But they are also experiencing a powerful cultural renaissance. Languages once on the brink of extinction are being revived. Traditions are being passed to a new generation. The story of the first peoples of the Americas is a story of survival against impossible odds. It is a story that is woven into the very fabric of the land we all live on. It is a story that is still being written every single day in every act of resistance, celebration, and renewal. Thank you for watching. This is Zodiac, signing off.